Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. This is a re-recorded version of a lecture which I gave yesterday. It's the first in a series of 4 over the next 4 weeks. Today we have what's more of a traditional way of the Devon and Cornwall Record Society in examining history through documents, but we follow with 3 other examinations, all focusing on place, and the approach is slightly different. Now, on the 5th of February, we have Stephen Rippin on Exeter, A Place and Time, which is concerned with Roman and medieval Exeter and its hinterland. Catherine Lorigan follows a week later on Baconic, and then we end up with Nat Alcock and Martin Cherry, Medieval Cornish Buildings, New Discoveries. It's a tremendous series, and if you are a Devon and Cornwall Record Society member, you can, of course, book for free through me, which you have the details for. But there is also a spring series following on from that, the 12th of March, 4 weeks again of subjects which enhance the reading for Devon and Cornwall Record Society members of their volume for 2021 on East Devon churches. Now, non-members can book through Eventbrite, and all the details for all 8 lectures are on the Devon and Cornwall Record Society website. Now, I'd like to precede this lecture with an apology to any of those members of the Devon and Cornwall Record Society who have been patiently waiting for the recommencement of the Dean Mills project, and also for our new Strangers project. Both are in hand, but at the moment I am working flat out 5 days to 6 days a week on this Record Society volume. I intend to have it finished within the next fortnight, and then we'll hopefully get right back to the research. And hopefully you will also be able to see through this lecture just how complicated this 3rd volume has become. Now, the lecture began, for me, the topic at least, with a single question. Why could I find no church rates for Dartmouth when they were apparently used across the county? Why the only place not to rate parishioners in this way? My realization came suddenly when I realized what I've been doing with this long project on parish taxation is revealing the inner workings of local life, but volumes 1 and volumes 2 didn't have the ancillary documents to understand our rates until I came across Dartmouth and then Crediton and slightly Colyton. Now, those who have been using the volumes will understand Barnstable is already featured, and although it does have a good civic collection, they are yet to be listed properly, and they're being done at the moment. So I have to admit, I was a bit wary of saying anything trying to be definitive about Barnstable until I could actually see the documents. So that will come, although in hindsight. So I'm finishing this 3rd set of Devon taxation records. And these cover, again, 1500 to 1650. And Devon will be the only county in the UK to have such records printed in full. Volumes 1 and 2 comprised 186 lists. Volume 3 has another 112. But Volume 3 will be dominated by Crediton and Dartmouth, where these documents in taxation, as well as others, are so extensive. Interestingly, they've been largely, if not completely, unused. Now, I am going to share my screen and hit this and hit that and hit this again. And we're going to move right on to what's in Volume 3. And you will see from this that the ones in red are those which are particularly good for other documents as well as taxation. There are some surprises within that. A few documents which only have recently turned up. One particular one was put in the wrong box, and I have been able to use it for 6 years, but the archive staff have recently triumphantly brought it out for me. This is going to be the image for the cover of the volume, the well-known, or one of the well-known maps of Dartmouth for the early 1600s, which appears to have been based on a much earlier map as well. From here on, we have 3 more volumes. Provisionally, these are the divisions. It's going to partly depend on how much space I allow certain parishes, because we can't edit all of the rates, because some of them, like Ashburton, are very extensive, or Chudley. But even so, I'm hoping this is more or less going to be it. It's going to have to be a rates volume at least every 3 years. So this is going to take me another 10 years, I should imagine. Now, taxation records are overlooked, despite their having been worked on for this society by Professor Hoskins and Mrs. Marjorie Rowe. They've been largely left to family historians, who quite rightly value them as a tremendous source for naming individuals and placing them in a particular place. Some local historians consult them, but they're unaware possibly that many are difficult to identify because they're hidden in church warden accounts or overseers the poor accounts, and others lie far away from Exeter and archives across the country. The writing and the condition make some of these rates difficult to use. Now, this is one which you can see the obvious damage, partial page survival. Here's another where just the use of it threatens the survival of the document. Water damage here. Water and possibly fire damage on the top up here. I'm not entirely certain what's happened to this. Unfortunately, it's an important rate, and I do not have all the details. They simply do not survive. Now, some of these are highly significant, and if you've been following these volumes, you will have seen that Barnstable's 2 rates for 1500 and 1507 were completely unknown and act in as close to a census as we could hope for those years. They're early, and they are remarkably full of detail. And there are other things that I think are going to surprise people as well. This is another document here that you can see damaged, but that's been repaired. Most of our rates, which are in a bad state, nearly all of them, say 98, 99% of them, have yet to have any conservation work on them. I have also taken notice of the construction of the manuscripts. Now, this is a way of keeping 2 documents together. It looks like a piece of yarn, which is stitched these vellum pieces together in order to keep them together. But I realized after doing Claude Passavant's cloth book of Exeter for the 1700s that the largest surviving samples of yarn, thread, and string lie in our archives. So I've been noting down examples of these, which you can see here. Often they're single sheets of paper which have been folded, put together, and then stitched with, I feel uncomfortable calling it string or thread. It's more like thread or thring. It's a little bit of thread and a little bit of string, but they are, well, here's clearly string. But some of these are very early repairs, and this is for the rate of 1500 or 1507 for Barnstable. And I'm wary of telling conservation about this. The archivists are unaware of them, as far as I know, because I think they're part of the history of these documents. If 500 years ago they actually put these together in that way, they are historic in themselves. Now, I've also been trying to notice some other things in case they are of use to the society. I'm hoping we're going to have several illustrations here to show how the scribe was tackling his lettering. It is a him, because I can't find any woman having done this. And I assume there may be a number of scribes. Dartmouth was big enough to, I think, to offer a great deal of work. And you can see the capital letters aren't always followed through in the names themselves. The ones on the left mostly, but not always, whereas the ones on the right aren't used like that at all. So we may have these few sample pages. They are tremendously, I find them tremendously interesting. This is another one where, and we could do this probably 10 times with different lettering, just to show you how much they changed. Look at the Q down below, let alone the N. Now, it is a male world. Oh, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. I think it's escaped historians. Wait a minute, I have gone far ahead than I should have done. Tipped over too many pages, sorry. Now, I think most historians who've used these records see them as revealing parish hierarchies, but they unravel the differences in how parishes were organized. And I think, if anything, these three books are an eye-opener in how different one parish was from another and the way that it was administered. So many parishes had what was called in Devon sidemen or questmen or synodsmen, which acted like a parish council would today. And they were known variously as the 4, the 5, the 6, the 7, the 8 men. Their number differed from parish to parish and could change in one place over time. There were usually 2 church wardens, but not necessarily, and the numbers of these overseers of the poor could also be substantially higher. It has escaped historians, at least here in Devon, how different these arrangements were from one parish to the next. It is only possible through the examination of local tax records that this becomes apparent. I mean, not surprising, one has to spend time with hundreds of tax records in order to see this, and it's not an exercise most historians would do. Now, this is more obvious, the differences from one place to another before the Reformation, because the Catholic Church had more roles. But in the late 1500s, parishes became the preferred administration unit for national government. And with this came an increase of expected duties, such as way wardens. They were established by Westminster in 1555. And each parish had to apportion 2 men as way wardens to look after the local roads. And in some places, they were called supervisors of the highways. Now, the differences one can see from one parish to another is apparent in Milton Abbot. They had 2 collectors for the poor, 8 bread wardens. Of these 8, 2 worked in each quarter, and they sold bread, cheese, girts, candles, and meat. There was a high warden, 1 man who sold church property, including gifts from parishioners of sheep and wool. And he also collected money for graves and from fines. There were 2 wardens of the common store in either the North or the South Downs, and they accounted for the bread and the ale made from the gathered oats, which was brought in on a rate. There were 3 receivers who collected cash from all the wardens, but not from the collectors of the poor. And there were 1 or 2 payers who oversaw the costs for maintenance of parish buildings, for the military, and for local policing. Now, that parish is the only one to organize itself, as far as I can see, in that way. In contrast to Milton Abbot, Dean Prior had 4 sidemen each year, called the 4 men. At least they were from 1565 to 1622. But in 1584 to 1587, there was a gap when there were 8 men instead of 4. They also had 2 wardens, otherwise we would have called them church wardens, but they were also called head wardens. And they were there, we know, from 1554 to 1628. There were either 2, 3, or 4 collectors of the poor, otherwise known as the overseers of the poor, from 1569 to 1626. Now, how do I know this? Well, it is all laid out for me and Dean Pryor's book of church, poor and high wardens accounts. And you can see somebody has very painstakingly taken these details down. And they are quite interesting. One of them is, one notices there are very few women involved. Now, women do feature when they're heads of household as contributors to rates, but on the whole, women are excluded. And I cannot find a woman who is a church warden, at least not one who did the job. We have here a number of women who are appointed church warden, but then we see there's a deputy, generally a male family member, who does the actual work. No woman yet I have found to have signed a rate of any kind. So I think it is very much a male world, and that was brought home to me when I looked at the back of a document of Dartmouth from 1613, and we have some text which I think was which illustrates just how male this world is. He writes, "There are but 6 things we have need of in this life: the grace of God and a quiet life, a contented mind and an honest wife, a good report and a fund in store. What need a man of any more?" Well, this was written from a male perspective, and I'm assuming it was intended only for male eyes. I don't think they would have thought any woman would have seen it. So he was pretty safe writing the next few lines. And I apologize for the misogyny in this, but this is as it was written. A big woman is lazy. A little woman is loud. A fair woman is sluttish. A black woman is proud. Now, these are all things which we hear today, except for the bottom one, a black woman is proud. Well, I think we have to question what he meant by a black woman. Many people today would assume that was an individual of African heritage, but in fact, it probably meant, as they meant black man or black woman, as somebody with very dark hair. And I'm sure this is only coincidental, 129 years earlier, the first recorded black man in Devon did live in Dartmouth. James Black was there in the 1400s, and I am assuming that Dartmouth was like Plymouth and Barnstable, 2 other major ports in Devon, that Dartmouth also shared, like them, the history of having some African migrants and mixed race children. But I think black women in this sense, I don't think refers to race, but hair color. Now, curiously, the scribe finished his poetry with the 6th line: a big woman is lazy, a little woman is loud, a fair woman is sluttish, a black woman is proud, and added, and if she were as little as she is good, a peach red in June would make her a hood. Much more mysterious. There may be a meaning there which one can decipher, but I'll leave that to you. Now, incidentally, as a hold on from Black history, one might want to look at a place name for Sandford, which is included in the Crediton lists. In 1630, one of the land holdings is called Black Man's Coombe. Now, the name goes back 300 years earlier to the 1330s. But it evolves so that its name no longer Black Man's Coombe, but evolves into Blackmore Coombe. And its early date in the evolution of the name, I have to admit, raises more questions than it answers. It may have nothing to do at all with somebody connected with Africa at some time, but it might. There are particular curiosities in the records, and the page themselves need attention. I try very carefully to read all of these marginal notes, just in case there's something there. I think they're often just scribblings. They're usually just scribblings, but not always so. Now, I find these fascinating, and I'm hoping you do too. It could be a scribe just practicing his lettering or a new pen. In some of the text that you see on the back of a page is repeated within the document itself, but not always. And we can pick out things, named Doddridge here, done several times, Richard Doddridge. But some may have a significance that we can't quite see. This is Dean Prior, and in a later hand, somebody has scrawled, "If that it chance the wars for to fight, more than to wit trust not to thy might. For wit without strength much more doth prevail than strength without wit to consequence in battle." Well, oddly enough, this is the parish of Robert Herrick, and Robert Herrick may well be the man who's responsible for writing into the earlier church warden and oversees the poor accounts these little lines of text. I don't know, it's out of my expertise for what I have, but it is worth noting that that is there, and that's in the volume, of course. These are the more traditional marginal notes that one might know of. These are manicules. They are indications from the scribe that this is a part of the text which is important. And you can see the finger pointing to the text on the right, and he's added good precedent. Example from Exeter Cathedral, which of course the medieval period is famous for. We see the fingers with their fingernails, and it's turned into the back of the head of a hybrid human dragon. Hooker himself did it, John Hooker, in this map of 16th century Exeter at the Bishop's Palace. He's pointing out part of the city walls. And then the scribe here is pointing to problems with the financial accounting of the militia. You can see he's noting a little bit of text, his commentary on this, the mending of a scour and the sword hanging. And then he also puts down making clean of our armor, saying it's been paid for already. This, I don't know what it means. Luckily, it's not a document that matters to me, but I've noticed that this little hand is pointing up to two circles. Now, sometimes one wonders if they're there by accident or not, but here's another instance which clearly shows that that's important. What it means, I don't know. But these are important. Now, here on the right, interestingly, this is the document of 1649. If we look at this page, which I've expanded here, you can see we are calculating in Roman, but down here we are doing side tallies in Arabic. And so this column here works out to this figure, 7 shillings and 6 is this. So we have them all added up together, blum, 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 and put down. But one of the things which I learned is important is not just Thomas Brown not able to pay, but the tally marks. These are showing how many times that they have paid their rate. Sometimes it's done quarterly, other times it's done monthly. And one can find, say, 11 out of 12 payments, and one sees in the birth and burial and marriage records that somebody has moved away or somebody has died. Now, this is one which I think is important. This is a Crediton document, and what one notices after a little while is this here. These little dots are important. You will have remembered from Beer Ferrers that I found these documents there with the same thing. So down here, we have a series of dots which correlate to pounds, shillings, pence, and then farthings. It's a complicated system which is repeated here in Crediton. Very easily to overlook. And what we have again is Roman numerals, again, and this dot system. Now, I had been unaware of this system until I began working on the rates, became suspicious that they weren't just problems of writing, but they actually had a meaning. So I consulted Charles Trice Martins, the record interpreter. In 1910, he explained the system. Now, my copy was given to me by Joyce Ewings, a long-standing editor of the Record Society, who I now suspect came across this system on other documents in Devon, for which I have not yet come across myself, but they were used in this example in Crediton. Now, what we have are single units when there is a run across, and then if it's above or below or in different columns, a different calculation. So above the line on the left-hand side in the pound and shilling columns, a dot counts for 10 units. But above the line on the right-hand side in the pound and shilling column, they only count for 5. Above the line on the left-hand side in the pence column, they count for 6. It's a very complicated system, which I'm sure anyone listening has absolutely no idea from that how to do it. So I'll show you the example from Charles Trice Martin. And these are annotations, I think, in Joyce's own hand. Now, what's interesting about this is that this is a medieval system of calculation which is dying out, and we're finding it still used in some parishes across Devon, as if they're still using a calculus and instead of coming up with a calculator. So you can see on the line, it's a pound. And it's 5 shillings, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But when it's these as 5, one above is counted at 5, they're all counted as 1, that's counted as 1, so it's 9 shillings. As I say, the record interpreter, you will find this, and I have put this into the various volumes, and it's again in this volume. Now, religious change is seen in the tax list when society changed from Roman Catholic to Protestant to Roman Catholic to Protestant. And a number of the parishes in volume 3 are collecting grain instead of cash, but this gradually tails off as Devon becomes more Puritan and there's a dislike of church ales. The parishes are collecting grain in order to produce beer, particularly with the barley, and the funds were used from the party that they have for good causes. But all that frolicking upset puritanical sensibilities, and the Puritans pushed in parish after parish for grain rates to be replaced with financial rates. And it's largely because of them that the medieval church ales die out and we're left with parish taxes today. Now, tax records show also, and this I find absolutely fascinating, and here, well, here's an example from Coombe Martin where they are still, there's one settlement, and there are 5 bushels of oats expected from that instead of a parish rate of money. Tax records also show, oh, and here's one again, sorry, showing the vessels that are being used for the parish to be rented out for brewing of other ales, because you have bride ales, you have christening ales. And there's a Protestant disregard for Catholic literature, which is shown through these tax lists. So this is a late 16th century Easter book for Clay Hanger. And as you can see, each individual is assessed for their personal tithe, for maybe a garden penny, for what cattle they have. And the document ends with just a slip of paper, and they've used a Catholic liturgical document as a binding. Now, this is an illuminated manuscript. It's meant to be part of a church service breviary with musical notations, you can see on the right. And it is roughly 700 years old. So I find it extraordinary that the scribe must have gone into a parish chest and pulled out some old materials that nobody wanted. He needed a cover, and so he recycles this bit of paper, which would have been considered sacred at one point, and recycles it with this Protestant indifference. But that is 700 years old. And there are other examples of rates being bound up. Here's another example. I think this is 1400s. I don't think this is earlier. I think it's 1400s. Now, Crediton is one of the three parishes which emerged from here with a bit of interest. It has some documents which help us understand the rates. Crediton and Dartmouth help us a bit more, but I should say that Crediton or Curtin is going to be examined more fully in a lecture by Tony Gale for the Society, which will be online in the middle of the year, and we're currently working out a date for that. But Colyton, Crediton, and Dartmouth are particularly interesting. And they're interesting because we can see them emerging with greater financial independence in the early 1500s through either treason or through the Reformation. Now, Colyton, you may remember, has the most sensational quote about parish rates that any part of England, as far as I know, knows. This woman was upset that her neighbor, who was having an affair with the tax collector, had her rates reduced. And she said she wishes her blank, 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 blank was as good as Joan Dodge's, and she wouldn't have had to have paid so much. Well, Colyton is a parish with a particular history which is interesting for rates. 1538, Henry Courtenay is executed for treason. The crown seizes his lands, and a few years later, in 1547, a group of local men, 20 men, purchase the rights of the manor, and which includes the fairs. They find the Colyton Grammar School, and the Colyton fees are, of course, still going nearly 500 years later. Now, the church patron continues to be the dean and chapter, but it looks as if the fees start taking over responsibilities which one would have expected from the sidemen. They're looking at the poor, and I think they have a role in the church. So the only church warden and overseers of the poor accounts for the late 16th, early 17th century are fair copies, which were recorded for the fees. And this is what we have here. Still owned by them and housed in Colyton. Now, they are similar to Exeter City Council, which also benefited from the loss of Courtenay's influence. The council, as it will become, benefits from their disgrace by purchasing or being given X Island and the rights along the River Exeter, River Exe. So both Colyton and Exeter emerged in the mid-1500s more independently, and we can see that in the way that they govern themselves. But it's Crediton. Oh yeah, and here's an example of one of the nice pieces of those documents. The Overseers of the Poor account in Colyton, at least, list all the poor who were being given money. So I've been able to take out for the relevant year not only the wealthier who are paying money in, but the poor who are being given that money to look after themselves. But Crediton is of remarkable interest to us. A group of men like in Crediton, like in Colyton and Exeter, also benefited from the machinations of the Tudor court. In both places, the establishment of grammar schools were one of the first consequences, and incidentally, both survive today, all these centuries afterwards. Crediton's documents share themselves with Sandford, which was a chapelry of Crediton, and in some records, the two groups of parishioners were separated, but in others, they are listed together. In 1500, Crediton's local government was dominated by the bishop, who had been based in the town before 1046. But for the following 450 years, the manor and borough was retained by the bishop, and what had been the bishop's cathedral in Crediton had been turned into a collegiate church, that is, a church run by a community of canons. They were paid for in the early 1500s by a taxation on local people. Crediton and Sandford were divided into 12 areas, and the entire community was required to pay. Now, this is a early drawing of Crediton, which I discovered a couple of years ago, and which John Heel and Tony Gale are working on. This is a view of the south front. I'm told this is the earliest drawings we have of Crediton's church, and possibly of more interest is this little drawing of several buildings in Crediton, which may relate to some exciting maps which exist in Crediton itself, but that's going to be other people's work. So what we have in 1500 is the bishop retaining the borough and the manor, but Crediton church itself dividing up the parish and Sandford into areas which paid for their staff. 100 years later, we find the manor and the borough have been sold by the crown because they've been taken away by the bishop at the Reformation, and the canon fee and the 12 prebendaries are owned by the 12 governors. What is particularly interesting is that in 1600, local people are still paying along this Catholic way for a tax which paid for men in the church who are no longer employed by the church, or indeed do these men get the money in any way, but goes to the 12 governors. So the 12 prebends you see listed there. There are also tithings, so East Town, West Town, and town tithing, in which all the people are separated, for which they pay their tithes as they continue across the country as well. But what we have are documents listing all of these people. Now, Tony Gale has done this great map showing where the prebends are, or at least where they're centered. And we have another map of the tithings. Now, what has survived and apparently has been unnoticed are these extraordinary documents. A church rate of 1549, which is highly interesting to us because that's the year that the Prayer Book Rebellion swept through Crediton. And that rate, which was special to that year, was for the repairs to the church. There's also a church rate of 1619, but the Easter Book and the tithe accounts, which are both tithe records, are extraordinarily detailed, and I think tell us things we don't expect. So here's the 1594 listing of all the prebends, and you can see the details there of each individual. Sometimes it gives us detail of where they're from. and any family members that may be living with them. Here you can see more detail, and it is, I think, for anybody interested in Crediton or Sandford history, it is essential because it ties individuals to places. And it shows just how wealthy they were or were not. But this is the one which I think is of most interest. If we go to the Easter book, what we see the scribe doing is he's listing people for what they're paying for a personal tithe, because everybody owes tuppence to the church. And they're separating individuals. I think these are households. And as we can see, John Leakley and his wife is probably living with a servant called William Lucas. Whereas on the bottom, Gilbert Ware and his wife seem to have Thomas Bennet and his wife living together. Now, this acts as a type of census. So what we find are in Westtown, 148 households and 450 people. Now, these are provisional figures. I've got to go over them again. But in Easttown, 167 households and 550 people. Added to this would be children. So we are starting to have an estimate of the size of the population of Crediton, for which details are pretty sketchy. So these details, of which I don't have time to go into much detail here, but they are extraordinarily rich for Crediton. And we'll hear more about this from Tony Gale later in the year. Dartmouth is, of all of them, the most significant. From 1500 to 1650, it was one of Devon's major ports. Its wealth was generated through the export of Totnes cloth and an engagement in overseas fisheries. It was one of 8 boroughs which elected 2 MPs. The others, of course, were Plimpton, Plymouth, Bearferrers, Totnes, Tiverton, Exeter, Dartmouth, Barnstable, and 2 for the county of Devon. Now, this compares with 20 for Cornwall. In the 1620s, Dartmouth had 60 voters. They didn't call them voters, they called them voices, or at least they did in Exeter and Dartmouth. Dartmouth has a much more complicated history, or at least it's complicated by the amount of material that one can use to decipher its history. There are some 8,000 documents. In the 1920s, the Devon and Cornwall Record Society helped save these papers. They were transferred from Dartmouth to Exeter Library into the care of Mr. Tapley Soper, who was the librarian and the honorary secretary of the society. He and Mr. Watkins sorted the collection, and surprisingly, 100 years later, there is still no overall catalog, and is largely because this collection is unused or unknown, as it should be, that what I have to say is largely unknown. The Dartmouth records independently show how international Dartmouth was. Visitors constantly arriving from other parts of the UK as well from Europe. Ships regularly come from the Americas and Asia during this period. And not surprisingly, there was a continual need to question these foreign men who show up in the ports. And in this, Dartmouth emerges differently from what I would expect was like happening in Colyton or Crediton. Its merchants were closely connected with particular countries, and many are known to have spent years training in foreign ports. Many of these men spoke a number of foreign languages and acted as interpreters when sailors had to be interrogated. The borough boasted to the king about the port's intercourse with strangers, but they were well able to handle apparently any language which was thrown at them. It may be helpful to note how complicated the borough is. The borough is known as Clifton, Dartmouth, Hardness. There was also Southtown and Northtown. And as you can see, there's the Church of St. Petrox, the Church of St. Saviour, the Church of St. Clement in the parish of Townstall. So this view of Dartmouth from the 1660s is taken from what would now be the Royal Britannica Naval College. And we're looking down 2 miles to the castle right here. We have Townstill right in front of us. Hardness is just below the ridge. North Town is Dartmouth itself coming up to Townstill. South Town is the other side of the center of Dartmouth, running down to the river. And we have St. Petrock's Church at the castle, St. Saviour's in the center of what is now Dartmouth, and Townstill has its church, St. Clement's, above. Now, this is important to note because of all the various jurisdictions. Unusually, the town had 3 churches, and when one thinks about it, Plymouth, Ashburton, Totnes, Colyton, Tiverton, Barnstable only had 1. Exeter, with nearly 20, was even more unusual, but 3 is still pretty distinctive. The reason why it had 3 was Townstill's church, which was the main church for Dartmouth, was on a hill. So the corporation was able to build one in the center of Dartmouth, St. Saviour's, with the permission of the Abbot of Torre, who had the patronage of Townstill. So they did that in the medieval period, and it was a church built through the coffers of the borough, and the church, through the abbot, insisted that Dartmouth Corporation also paid for the vicar. So the building was maintained and the salary of the vicar by Dartmouth. At the dissolution of Torre Abbey in the 1540s, Dartmouth Corporation bought the patronage of Townstill up here on the above, which includes St. Saviour's. So it had, from then on, the ability to appoint the right type of vicar and to collect the tithes. Now, this is the interesting bit on why there are no surviving church rates for Dartmouth. And this is because Dartmouth, I think, held on to sufficient numbers of property at the Reformation. It should have given up any property which was used for what the government considered superstitious purposes, but they redefined those purposes and retained property which had been given by parishioners before the Reformation, and they used that property in order to pay for the church. Now, this was a theory until I read the Glebe Terrier for St. Saviour's of 1613, and the scribe writes, "There was never any rate made to the knowledge of the said church warden for the reparation of St. Saviour's, but the same is and has always been repaired at the charge of the corporation of the said town and by that common stock." Now, we also had fees operating the 3 Dartmouth churches, but the biggest picture is more intriguing. Dartmouth increased its independence and the wealth generated from that through the 16th century. In 1511, and continuing until 1860, the borough rented its river rights from the Duchy of Cornwall. Now, the duchy had owned them since the 1330s. This included the right to levy local shipping customs. They also held their own water bailiff's court, which oversaw the policing of local waters. This removed them from the control of the High Court of Admiralty and the local Vice Admiralty. Meanwhile, the main manor, that of Dartmouth, Clifton, Hardness, fell into abeyance because of another instance of treason, therefore removing any manorial control on the corporation. Dartmouth organized its policing in a very different way as well. Now, we have wards in Exeter, Plymouth, and Dartmouth, and possibly other parts of Devon, though I have yet to find them. 3 places with wards, also known as quarters. So there's the East Quarter, West Quarter, North Quarter, and South Quarter known today, but they were wards. Plymouth has Loo Street, Old Town, Banner, and Vintry. Dartmouth also had wards. Now, wards are a way of organizing policing. Each ward would have 2 or more constables at night and through the day who were enforcing local law. Dartmouth didn't have 4, it had 6. Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday wards. And oddly enough, we have documents listing all of the men for each of them. It's an unparalleled document. So we have one that I know of for Exeter for the 17th century, but here we have a handful, a nice little run for Dartmouth listing all of the men. Dartmouth emerges as an extraordinary place. A visitor in the 18th century commented it was a seaport built upon the side of a rock, the scent of which greets the traveler with pitch, tar, and dried fish. Nature seems to have kept her original rudeness here, for they are all very rough. And if they possess any improvement from art, it is the art of swearing, in which few could beat them. The women being the most vulgar. They go fishing. They row passengers over in boats. They tie their petticoats between their legs as if they're wearing trousers, and they have short pipes in their mouths. They are not very desirable objects, and it is no great wonder men do not break their marital oaths. What is not obvious to him is that Dartmouth had carved out an existence with a limited hinterland in Devon, but with an extraordinary interaction with commercial centers increasingly spread out across the world. In the 16th and 17th century, it used the Reformation to increase its independence, and it increasingly became low church. By 1642, like other places in Devon, it supported Parliament and not the king. The council was comprised of merchants and no gentry, and it was they who decided upon the type of vicar to preach from the town's pulpits. Increasingly in the early 1600s, it is obvious how puritanical the council had become. Its distinctions are apparent in its tax records. Now, we can visit Dartmouth today and see an extraordinary legacy of carved wood in the screen, in the pulpit, and the reshaping of a medieval door, and church fittings in plasterwork. Dartmouth is not independent completely from Devon, but is more so, I think, than other places. And its records are extraordinarily thick and rich. We get to see Dartmouth growing and expanding. This map is caught at the time in which it's the Butterwalk and the other buildings are expanding across and being in the mill pool being filled in. I think the lesson we need to look at is here in Exeter, and this has been troubling me, and I do wonder what Stephen Roberts, our president, would say. But Exeter in 1660 looked back at the years of Puritan rule of 14 years from 1646 to 1660. The council closed 13 out of 17 parish churches and offered them for sale. It divided the cathedral into 2 halves after closing it for a year and a half. It converted the bishop's palace to a stable and a sugar refinery. The chapel, chapter house, and the chapel of the Holy Ghost also became stables. Vicar's Choral wool hall, St. John's Hospital was a yarn hall. Treasurer's house became a bridewell. Lady Chapel was a library. Deanery was a poorhouse. And they destroyed the cloisters and redeveloped the site as a cloth hall. This was, in effect, Exeter's second Reformation. What's interesting is the complaints we have in 1660 and how they are worded. We have people pointing out all of this and saying this was not legitimate. It was not brought through the consent of the commons, of the majority of the population. We see the the puritanical low church Exeter Council, which is similar to councils all across Devon at the time, called chambers, but they become councils. We see them criticized for operating as they do without consent and ridiculed as a group of men who self-appoint themselves, which they do, of course, whether it's 12 or 24 councillors. When one dies, there isn't a public vote. They decide on who the successor is. In effect, the same type of people go from generation to generation. They are the same type of people who could keep outsiders away from decisions that are being made in the council. So what's interesting with this is after 100 years of the Reformation and growing independence, I think what's becoming apparent through these poor rates, through the church rates, through the taxation, is how not only differently they are acting, but how similarly they are. Barnstable, Exeter, Crediton, Tiverton, Dartmouth, Plymouth. In 1660, they emerged in a very different way than after 100 years of an experiment. I'm suspecting that as we go through, what will become more and more apparent is that the people who here are being listed in our church rates are those men who are making the decisions. These are the low church men who dominate local politics. So it isn't just a list of parishioners, it's a list of the Puritan elite mixed with others. The more we go through these documents, the more this is going to become apparent. Thank you very much. Now I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to stop the recording just to say, if you would like to know more details of other lectures, please look on our website. And thank you for listening.